Hello, this is Introduction to Rubrics. I'm Stephanie Foster, Assessment Lead in the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Colorado Boulder. In this session, you will learn about the appropriate uses for rubrics and become familiar with the essential components of designing a rubric for class assignments. The use of rubrics as an assessment tool dates back to the mid-1990s, so not so long ago. Rubrics have since been growing in popularity and use in higher education since at least 2005 and are currently being used in many different contexts. A rubric is a guide that articulates the expectations for an assignment and communicates the level of quality for performance or learning. Rubrics are typically used to score student performance on defined criteria and levels of quality or intellectual or skill development over time. Rubrics can be simple and short or complex. They can be qualitative, providing narrative feedback, or quantitative, providing numerical scores, or all of the above. There are two main types of rubrics used in higher education. The analytic rubric is what we'll spend our time talking about today, but I'd like to show you both. So the analytic rubric specifies at least two characteristics to be assessed at each performance level and provides a separate score for each characteristic. You would use analytic rubrics for identifying particular strengths and areas of improvement across a research paper, for instance. And you can use it to provide detailed, formative feedback on student work. A holistic rubric, on the other hand, provides a single score based on an overall impression of a student's performance on a task. You should use a holistic rubric when a single dimension is adequate. So perhaps you have a short assignment or you want to give quick or summative feedback. I'd like to show you an example of both an analytic and a holistic rubric used for the same task. When I was at George Mason University, I created a product rubric for looking at the results of undergraduate research products. So for this purpose, we defined an analytic rubric. We wanted to understand the dimensions of what went into that student product. Now, a student product might be a research paper or report. It might be a poster at an event. But basically, this is the end of their work. So this is summative evaluation. So you see the dimensions listed on the left, starting with articulation of problem, purpose, or focus, and continuing down the line to quality of delivery. So in this case, in this rubric, you'll see that the dimensions are then aligned with 4 levels of performance from expert to novice. And in each lines up with a description of student performance. So in this case, we're looking at the 4th dimension down, analysis or interpretation. You'll see that at the emerging level, the product would show that the student used evidence to support a limited analysis of the problem and that their interpretation is partially linked to a theoretical framework or scholarly model. If you just move up to the proficient level of performance, you'll see that there's an improvement. The evidence now supports an adequately complex analysis of the problem, and the interpretation is adequately linked to the theoretical framework or scholarly model. And as you see improvement, you can move up into the expert category. Now, one of the really great uses of an analytic rubric is that you can define specifically where students are performing really well and other areas where they're performing not so well. So they may be stronger in articulating their problem, for instance, and weaker in, say, their quality of delivery or their implications or impact. Now, for that same product that we're looking at, we could use a holistic rubric, and here's the example. So you'll notice we use the same 4 levels of performance from expert to novice, but in this case, there's a very brief summary under each of those scales. So the reason we designed the rubric in this way is that we had two different purposes in mind. The first was that the analytic rubric would be used by the instructor or the mentor to look in depth at a student product. We felt like that instructor or mentor was the only person who could really look at the product in that detail. But we were also holding celebrations of scholarship and presentations where students would present their work or show their posters in poster sessions. And we wanted to be able to do an assessment of those products quickly by reviewers who were not the mentors. So we would need something where they could very quickly assess the entire product and give it one score. So both the analytic and the holistic rubrics have important uses at certain times. Now, why should you use rubrics? Essentially, a rubric is a communication tool between the instructor and the student. So a rubric creates a common framework and clear expectations for how students will perform. It creates consistency and fairness, using the same criteria and standards across all of the students in your class and across reviewers or multiple graders. I should note here that it's important that if you are using multiple reviewers or graders, that you need to spend time training them on the rubric and norming their scoring across samples so that graders are not interpreting the language in different ways, and thus this consistency and fairness notion would kind of go out the window. So you want to make sure that everybody's using this in the same way to promote consistency and fairness. Rubrics can promote transparency so that progress towards a final product and grades are clear. It reduces mystery and helps students to understand why they earned the grade or the feedback that they received. Some faculty think that rubrics can be used for faster assessment, and it can be done more efficiently when you have a rubric with well-defined categories and criteria for success. Now, I might add here that it's important when you're giving student feedback that you always add something particular to that student work, that you don't only use the rubric, but that students also receive written feedback and comments from you that are specific to their assignment. Rubrics can be used to identify strengths and weaknesses. So using the example that I just showed you, it could show exactly where students are doing well and where they need more support. So usually when students earn a B on a paper, you assess the paper in a holistic way to earn a B, but there are specific components that are not all earning B grades. You may have strengths in some areas, and areas maybe the conclusion was not a B, maybe the conclusion was a D, but overall the student performed well. But this could really help to identify specific strengths and weaknesses. And finally, rubrics are used for objective criteria. Rubrics are criterion referenced. This means that you compare all student work against the criteria for success and not norm referenced. So you're not comparing students to each other. So when should you use rubrics? A rubric can be used for assignments for which there's more than one answer. So really there's no point in using rubrics for a multiple choice exam, for instance. You can use rubrics for formative or summative assessment. And what's the difference here? I really like what evaluator Robert Stake wrote, that when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative. You still have time to improve it. But when the guests eat the soup, that's summative. You're done. So you can use rubrics in both a formative and a summative way. You can use rubrics for both process or product or performance. A process element might be something like how well a student communicated with team members for a group project. A product or performance might be a final research paper or the performance of a choreography. Rubrics are very useful when done appropriately for peer review, so students can use rubrics to look at each other's work and give feedback for improvement. And finally, rubrics are useful for self-assessment and improvement. This can promote higher order thinking, such as critical thinking and self-reflection, and can communicate that back with their instructor. Now let's talk about how do you create a rubric. In its simplest form, a rubric includes 5 things. The essentials are a task description, the outcomes or dimensions to be rated, these are the rows of the rubric, the levels of performance or the scale, those are the columns, a description of each characteristic at each level of performance or scale, this is the content of each of the cells, and a scoring strategy. We are going to focus on numbers 1 through 4. The scoring strategy will be covered in a separate presentation. So I'm going to continue to use the example that I showed you earlier from George Mason University. You should have a link to that in the content on the website where you're viewing this video right now. A task description. So on the first page, there's actually quite a bit of text, but if you sort through that text, ultimately you'll find the task description. This rubric is designed to evaluate the product of an undergraduate research or creative project. Products may include written documents, poster presentations, oral presentations or performances, artistic expressions, and interviews. So when you write your rubric, you should be very clear about the activity, the assignment, the performance, or presentation that's being assessed. Okay, the next, when you take a look at an analytic rubric, you'll see these different pieces. So you want to define your dimensions. Your dimensions are either about the product or performance, which we've discussed. So for instance, the use of evidence to make an argument could be a dimension. The use of examples could be a dimension, or the organization of ideas. Or it can be about process. So we use the example of communication for teamwork, for example. Or did the student follow proper protocols? This is whether how they perform the process of producing the work. And across the top, you'll see the scales or levels of performance. This describes how well the task is performed. So you might have different levels. You could have language describing those levels, such as exemplary, proficient, or needs work, complete, partial, or none, or you could have letter grades across the top. So let's look at dimensions or outcomes. And in this case, I'm continuing to use the example of the product rubric. The outcomes or dimensions to be rated, these are the rows. These are the skills, knowledge, and or behavior to be demonstrated. You should specify which skills, knowledge, or behaviors you are looking for here, and limit the characteristics to those that are most important to the assignment. So one thing I want to caution faculty on here is something I see quite often. And that is when I interview faculty about an assignment, they say, I want students to develop critical thinking skills. I want them to understand how to use multiple sources to make an argument. They almost never say things like, I want students to use proper grammar, I want them to use proper syntax, and have no spelling errors. And yet, when I take a look at their rubric significantly weights things like grammar, syntax, and spelling errors. So if those are things that you want to grade students on, then those things need to be included in your rubric and be clearly spelled out. Now, of course, you're going to have things that happen in student assignments that are unexpected. Maybe somebody does something that is wonderful and you want to reward them for that. Maybe they do something unexpected and various ways, and you want to be able to comment on that. You should always leave room for the unexpected or the wonderful things that you see in student work. But by defining these and clarifying these expectations, you do that not only for the student, but for yourself. Now, when you're thinking about scales or levels of performance, these are the labels that you use to describe the levels of performance, and they should be clear and meaningful. One of the things that I like to do, that I prefer, is to always have positive language. Positive and developmental language. So what I mean by developmental is that we know that students are learning and growing, and we want to represent that. So this is not representing a failure, but that you are performing at a certain level, and we know that you'll be able to improve. Now, of course, you may use letter grades, or you may use a word. Instead of novice here, you might have unacceptable, or maybe that's off the scale. Maybe you also have an unacceptable category, or maybe you just don't see an element in the student work at all. So they're required to articulate their problem, and maybe they don't do that at all. So that's not a novice. That's a 0 because they didn't do that. And so you just need to be clear what you expect. So when you're completing in an analytic rubric the description of each of these dimensions and according to each level of performance, it's good practice to start with the top category. So this describes the best work you expect using all of the characteristics. And then define the lowest category. What's an unacceptable product or the bare minimum that you expect to see? And then develop the descriptions of the intermediate level products in the categories. You should make sure that the language from column to column is similar and that your syntax and wording are aligned. So you should use specific descriptions, avoiding words like good or excellent, but use words that are clearer to students and provide areas that they can use to improve. I like to start my list of outcomes with the content, ideas, arguments, and then move to things like organization, grammar, and citation if those things are being evaluated. Now, what I've given to you today has been a very brief introduction to rubrics with not a lot of examples. If rubrics is something that you really want to learn more about, there are a couple really great books on the subject, pretty recent books. The second one, Introduction to Rubrics, should probably be on every faculty member's shelf. And one more slide, I want to talk about expanding our use of rubrics. So a 2009 review of research on the use of rubrics in higher education found that students tended to think of rubrics as helping them learn and achieve, so that formative use of rubrics, while instructors focused almost exclusively on rubric use for quick grading. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. And I think that the way that students are looking at it is the way that I look at it, although I do enjoy quick grading myself. But I'd like to encourage you to think about using rubrics as an instructional guide instead of or in addition to the use for grading. So how can you use rubrics to help provide a richer, more complex communication to students about expectations and about their ability to grow and to learn through this assignment. But here's the key. You can't just hand out the rubric to students. They must be taught how to use it for self-assessment and improvement. They must get practice and understand the language. So this is important for self-assessment and for peer assessment as well. Rubrics can be developed to assess learning performance over time, such as in a portfolio from one semester, from multiple semesters, or over the course of a student's academic career. Portfolios are very often used in certain academic fields such as teaching or education programs. They are often used in performance or visual arts, for example, and in a variety of other areas as well. Rubrics can be used to assess learning across sections of the same course. So if you want to understand, for instance, the impact of different teaching strategies across the different sections or other elements, you might use a rubric to do that kind of assessment, or across courses. So you can use the same rubric for similar kinds of assignments across courses. And finally, rubrics can be used in a very interesting way as a program guide to make decisions about programs, curriculum, and program assessment tools. So rubrics can be used for faculty to have shared understandings about what students are learning, where you want to see students go, and ultimately what the values of the department are in that program. And it can also be used to then create program assessment tools such as surveys and other kinds of, and to guide other kinds of assessment and evaluation.